In this video, I want to count down the 5 worst names that were retired and the 5 worst names that weren't retired. As in, like, the 5 worst calls from the NHC, but in both directions. I want to factor in both directions. So, what was the worst storm that had its name retired by the NHC? I would argue Hurricane Claus. While Claus did cause 11 fatalities, it caused only $1 million in damage and was honestly more well known for its 1984 incarnation rather than its 1991 that earned it its retirement. I feel like if Claus was retired, that would set a very bad precedent, which I'm thankful hasn't been adopted, on retiring minor storms that do not deserve to be retired. There's only one other storm that caused less than $150 million in damage that I can think of, and I think it was also from 1990, Hurricane Diana. But Diana was different, because Diana caused 90 deaths. And at 90 deaths, I think a storm has caused enough fatalities to where the human loss of life is enough to justify retirement off the bat. I think any storm that caused more than 50 deaths should be retired due to its impacts. Price tag's a little bit harder for me because, as we've seen, somewhat minor seeming storms can cause over $1 billion in damage. Hence, I think that cutoff is too low. I would personally support saying something like $3 billion, because if a storm causes $3 billion in damage, it's clearly not a minor system at that point. But $1 billion can be from a minor system. Like that relatively insignificant tornado from early June was on a no $1 billion list as $1.8 billion in damage. And any storm that causes less, that should not be retired. At least not by today's standards. Ooh, there's a terrible, terrible smell in the air. So I think that Claus was the worst storm to have its name retired. Obviously in the EPAC, I disagree strongly with the decision to retire storms like Vong Fong, but I do want to keep the City Atlantic. Another storm that I think was a bad idea to retire was Otto, especially with Earl not being retired. Earl caused 81 deaths and $250 million in damage. Otto caused 23 deaths and $190 million in damage. I'm not trying to underestimate severe impact in Nicaragua and Costa Rica. And fun fact, Otto is the latest Category 3 and 2 hurricane in the Atlantic, as well as the latest storm to, as well as the latest storm to get its name retired. So we have not retired any December storms or any storms that occurred later in November. Otto was the cutoff for any storm name that wound up earning retirement. And Otto was in mid to late November, just for any reference. Which, by the way, is more closely equated to winter than summer, fall at that point. I mean, it is fall, but a lot of times you could have wintry hellscapes ongoing at that point. Not to derail us too much, I feel like Otto was a bad decision to retire, especially because at that point in taunting Belize, I think, oh no, Earl caused 94 deaths. It was 81 in Belize. At that point, you're pretty much, oh no, it was 81 in Mexico, I think, and 13 in Belize. At that point, you're pretty much taunting the people in Belize and Mexico as to why their storm was retired, but the storm Otto was. Of course, Matthew is an unambiguous name that had to be retired. It caused destructive impacts in 3 different countries, and it was one of the worst weather disasters for Haiti's history. So having Matthew retired was obvious. It was obvious that Matthew had to go. But I feel like Otto shouldn't have went, especially if Earl didn't go. But I'm pretty sure I didn't put it all on my list. I forgot. I'll try to remember. Otherwise, I'll make up a storm name on the fly like I always do. Now, I think the third worst storm name to earn itself a retirement is Hurricane Paloma. $454 million damage is not a heavy price tag, but okay, it could justify retirement if the death toll was greater. But the death toll was a single loss of life. I don't think that a single loss of life can justify retirement, especially with that low of a damage total, because that's not really a significant storm. It might have been significant on one location, but it wasn't overall a significant storm. For example, I do sometimes grumble about Juan and Igua getting retired, especially because Juan's 2003 incarnation was arguably less destructive than its 1985 incarnation. By raw stats, it was less destructive, but given the impacts of the region, one could make the argument that 2003's was far worse. I personally view them as somewhat close to equal, but it's clear that Wikipedia would argue that no, 2003's Juan was way worse, given how it's one of Canada's worst hurricanes, but not even so for Louisiana, even though I feel like Alabama's impacts get totally cut out half the time when discussing Juan. But again, I think I grumble more about Igua simply because while it was the worst storm in Nova Scotia history, at some point you have to draw the line. At some point you have to say, where does a storm make landfall in a place that, you know, the damage isn't that significant? I mean, like, the worst hurricane in Oregon isn't going to get itself retired because destructive storms don't make it as far north as Oregon. Honestly, it's rare to make it as far as California, which is why in some storms, the brunt of the system has been in, say, Arizona. But even Arizona's rare. So I feel like for 3 deaths and $200 million damage, Igua as number 4 was another bad retirement because I feel like Newfoundland is a place where storms really can't get all that strong. So therefore, a system that strikes there really shouldn't be retired. It actually has 4 in total, but only 3 that far north. And I mean, Juan I can somewhat get, but Igua I really don't think should have been retired. Especially because looking at it, Tomas was retired, but Alex wasn't retired, Carl wasn't retired, Matthew wasn't retired. They all deserve retirement more than Igua did, and yet none of those 3 were retired. Arguably, even Hermine required retirement, but Hermine's impacts are a rather convoluted and mixy mess with all the impact in the Eastern Pacific, because it was Tropical Depression 11E before crossing over, and the crossover makes distinguishing the impacts a near nightmare. Especially because unlike Amanda and Cristobal, it wasn't sorted out properly. Amanda and Cristobal at least were sorted out properly, whereas it was left a complete mess for what was 11E's impacts and what was Hermine's impacts. Mainly because it was kind of less of a cutoff, and they still didn't give the same name, although I don't know how it would have worked with a tropical depression becoming an Atlantic storm. That would have been a bit tricky to figure out all the logistics. So the 5th storm that I feel that was retired that, probably shouldn't have been retired, to me, I really have a hard time just understanding, why they retired. What was I thinking again? I have a hard time, to me, really just understanding why they retired. What was that storm I was thinking of? God damn it, this is a problem. I realized, I think it was Isadora or Lily or one of them. These storms caused over $1 billion in damage, and they did cause like over a dozen fatalities. But I feel like I'm trying to think of which one caused the more impact in the Caribbean. That one I feel like could have been retired because that one would have been greater. But the one that primarily caused impacts in Louisiana, and again I can't remember if it was Isadora or Lily. I think both made landfall in Louisiana in the end. I feel like the other ones shouldn't have been retired, because while it was destructive, I just feel like, in today's standards, a storm like that would not be retired. No way. I feel like that storm was retired a little bit too loosely for just my satisfaction. Now, here are the 5 storms I feel like really should have been retired. Number 1 is a pretty obvious one, Hurricane Gordon of 1994. So, Gordon was chosen as a retirement for Gilbert in 1988, and I would argue that the impacts from Gordon in some ways exceeded those of Gilbert, the storm that it replaced. And Gilbert caused 300 deaths. So Gilbert by no means caused little impact. And while the damage toll from Gordon was 600 million, its death toll was an astounding like 1,150. Now, Haiti didn't request the retirement of the storm for an unknown reason. And damage in Haiti was only 50 million, despite 1,122 people dying there. However, the WMO did release a report stating why Haiti's infrastructure problems were mainly the reason as to why Gordon was so destructive, hinting that even if Gordon was brought for retirement, it would have been declined. I'm pretty sure the same fate happened to Hannah of 2008, which caused 529 deaths in Haiti, as well as 1 in the Dominican Republic and 7 in America, with $160 million for the U.S. impacts only. We don't know the Haiti impacts. I feel like Hannah should have been retired, although now it's hard to argue it's a primary topic given 2020's incarnation of Hannah, which in a way is actually turned out to be more destructive in some ways than Hannah. But Gordon, no storm can parallel it, because we had Hurricane Gordon in 2000, 2006, 2012, and while 2006 did cause some trouble in the British Isles, it was also even more known as a European windstorm than as a hurricane. And the damage total of 3.8 million is not as significant as any of Gordon's impacts. Even in the US, it caused 8 deaths and $400 million in damage, although that is not criteria for retirement. There were other deaths in other places, and Gordon actually had an interesting meteorological history behind it. Gordon was also a tropical storm in 2018 that wound up causing 2 deaths each in, 2 deaths in both Mississippi, or maybe Kentucky, and in Florida. So these other Gordons weren't without impact. But I feel like given the grand scheme of things, Gordon was a pretty obvious candidate for retirement in 1994, and I am shocked and disappointed in the WMO's decision to not retire a storm name that caused 1,000 people to lose their lives. Another storm I think was a bit despicable that wasn't retired was Hurricane Hilda. This storm also caused 300 fatalities and $120 million in damage. And given the decision to retire storms like Ione, I'm pretty sure, and Ione was less destructive by far than Hilda. $120 million back in 1954 was not an insignificant total, and 300 people died. Now, it possibly could have been due to a mix-up between names, because Ione actually formed before Hilda. So some people might have been misinterpreting storms. But I really think that Hilda should have been retired. And maybe Ione should have been retired too. But Hilda should have been retired, definitely. And I'm honestly a bit shocked and disappointed to see why Hilda was not retired. Another storm that could have easily won itself the ban hammer but didn't was Hurricane Gert, which again, another 100+ fatality storm, though this time its fatality total is a little bit lower, 116. And given how it caused $170 million in damage and is a clear primary topic for its name, I still have this hard time feeling how Hurricane Gert was not retired. And there were some other tropical systems that also caused 100+ fatalities. I'm not suggesting them here for one particular reason. That simply being that they were the more typical Central American storms that wind up not even causing significant damage at all and have very limited information about them. Like those storms, like an Agatha-like storm deserves to be retired, but not a lot of these storms aren't Agatha-like storms. They're storms that cause a high loss of life, but easily preventable. Now, I made an exception for Gordon's case because it's clearly notable, but in some cases, some of these storms are like, huh? And you've never even heard of them, and it sometimes can become a bit difficult to distinguish between these storms and other storms. Gordon and Good are storms that will always be remembered for their impacts, but for a storm like Brett, it might have caused over 200 fatalities. I have a hard time feeling this stuff. I mean, it probably should have been retired in the end game, but I could easily see why it was not. Given how, to be quite honest, it probably would have caused similar damage and deaths had it been a non-tropical system the whole time. It probably would have caused similar-ish impacts if it didn't even develop. And it would also have a harder time even achieving recognizability if it did not form as a tropical system. And of course, with a tropical depression, it would have had name recognizability, but a number can't be retired. You just can't have that. Like, no. So, that leaves me my number 4 spot to actually be Isaias and 5 to be Sally. Isaias caused $4.7 billion in damage and 17 deaths. Sally caused $7.3 billion in damage and 9 deaths. I would argue that the damage totals might not be high, the death totals might not be high enough to retire, but the damage total does make up for it in these instances. I mean, look at how much damage these storms cause, billions upon billions. Like, it's honestly could be overinflated damage totals, but Isaias could easily see a storm that rode up the East Coast in that much of a destructive manner. Sally, I'm a bit more skeptical on its damage toll, but I believe that if that amount is true, because it was verified by the NHC, I still think it should have been retired. Also, I'm a bit shocked that no sources have equated Isaias to be, Sally to be the costliest Category 2, or Isaias to be the costliest Category 1, but I guess they haven't. And even if they had, it might still be too trivial for something like Wikipedia anyway, given how they moved Ian's designation as the deadliest hurricane in the U.S. since Katrina of 2005. Of course, at that point, you're digging into semantics because you'd have to say the contiguous United States to exclude Maria, while at the same time saying it had to be a direct that's only to factor out Sandy. So at that point, you're digging too much into semantics. But that's all I can talk to you in this video for. Goodbye.